I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm not upset if it's pronounced Lowenstein or Lowenstein. My father and his brother were partners in business for 40 years in Danville, Virginia, and one called himself Lowenstein and the other one called himself Lowenstein. So how can I be disturbed by something like that? It's really not important. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I thank my cousin Frank Schwimmer for inviting me down here. We don't see enough of Frank. We live a long way apart. How far is it? About 500 miles, I guess, but we should see each other more often. And it's my first trip ever to Del Rey. I've been everywhere in Florida many times where there are newspapers or television stations, especially as a dean of one of the largest schools of journalism in the country. But I guess Del Rey doesn't have a newspaper or a television station, so maybe I've not gotten there, but I've heard a lot about it, and from the few days I've been here, I see what a beautiful place it really is, and so I'm happy to be here and join you. And I know when you invited me to speak here today, it's a history club, and there's some thinking about what I'm going to talk about for the last few weeks, and thinking about when we were small, and some of you may go back almost that far, but Jack Benny was our favorite program on Sunday night at 7 o'clock, and we'd all gather into the living room or wherever the radio was. The lights were usually off, and we all listened to the Jack Benny hour, half hour, whatever it was. But there was one running joke on Jack Benny's show that got a laugh every time. He was supposed to be very tight, you know, he wouldn't spend any money. And at some point in the show, someone would hold him up. A thief on the block would hold him up, or something like that, and pull out a gun, and he would say to Benny, your money or your life? And there was a long silence for a while, and then you heard the man shout again, I said, your money or your life? And Jack Benny would say, I'm thinking. I always got a big laugh. And so I was thinking, well, what am I going to talk about today? And I know you hear all kinds of stories and histories of various kinds, but probably not from the people who were actually there, because there were about 1,000 Americans and Canadians who volunteered for the Israeli army in 1948. And unfortunately, there are very few of us left alive. I was the second youngest, and the one who was the youngest died a number of years ago. I went to a reunion 2 years ago, and only 9 people showed up, and they were most of those. Very few, maybe a few couldn't make it out, but there are very few out of that 1,000 who left alive. And I became, many years ago, quite a few years ago, the archivist for the organization. We called it the American Veterans of Israel. And it occurred to me, and then at that time I was only probably in my 50s, that say, these people are not going to live forever. Nobody's doing anything on them. Nobody's writing about them, getting information. So I started sending out a very detailed questionnaire, 4 pages, detailed questionnaires, where their parents were born, they were born, education, where they served, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, I got about 400 questionnaires. And believe it or not, I'm the only person who ever did a survey of these people. One reason is that it was illegal. Most of us had violated some law in order. It's hard for us to believe now when we know the closeness between America and the United States. But in 1947 and 1948, we had a greatly anti-Semitic State Department, which I may talk about in a few minutes. There are all kinds of laws. Our passports, every passport that was issued that year by the State Department had a stamp in it, an actual stamp in it that said, not valid for travel to a foreign country for purposes of serving in a foreign army. And of course, there was only one foreign army that anybody wanted to serve in, so that frightened away a lot of people. So, and in those days, too, it was believed that you could lose your citizenship for doing that. And since the Supreme Court has ruled that no native-born American can have his or her citizenship taken away for any reason unless he or she renounces their citizenship. The State Department cannot take anybody's citizenship away. But that's not what we believed in those days, and it's not what the State Department wanted us to believe in those days. And so as a result, there were very few American volunteers. I mean, there were only about 1,000 of us. I was the only Columbia undergraduate. I'd finished my freshman year at Columbia. I was the only Columbia undergraduate who joined, and it's a significant number of students at Columbia University in New York City were Jews, and I think altogether maybe 4 or 5 people from Ivy League schools joined, and it was very, very difficult, and our parents were scared to death that we were going to lose our citizenship too. That made it even worse. That first of all, they didn't want us to do it. I never met but one of all those parents who agreed to have her child join the Israeli army. Parents, many of them were veterans of World War II and had survived one war, and parents didn't want them going out to another war, even though they may have loved Israel from afar in those days. So that was tough too. Anyway, that's what I'm going to speak about, and I call it my summer abroad in 1948. I was 18 years old and just about to finish my freshman year, and we knew that the Arab countries, surrounding Arab countries, 5 surrounding Arab countries, were going to invade Israel. They said they would. Even though they were members of the United Nations, they said boldly that they were going to invade. They didn't agree to the partition plan, as it was then called, and they were going to invade. And about the time, I guess, in May of that year, I saw a bulletin, a notice on a bulletin board that said the National Students Association was going to have a ship going that summer to England. They were seeking volunteers to go. Not enough British soldiers had been demobilized from World War II, and so they were seeking American college students to go and work on farms in England to take up the farm shortage in England. There was a shortage of labor. And so I thought, well, you know, I was there going my freshman year in Columbia and watching in Flushing Meadows, wherever it was at that time, the debate about the partition plan. It was an exciting moment when the United Nations passed the partition plan dividing Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And so if I were 18, I would be up for the draft in the United States Army. The Army was still drafting people at the age of 18, even in that year. And I believe strongly in the cause. I came from a Zionist home, even though I lived in a small town. I'm from Danville, Virginia, which had a population then of about 30,000 people, and 2 synagogues. That's another story. It's like a Jewish joke. We had 50 Jewish families and 2 synagogues, and 2 rabbis, and 2 buildings. One extremely Reform and the other one extremely Orthodox, and 80% of the people were conservative. I mean, if a comedian were talking about this, everybody would be laughing, which I'm laughing a little bit when I think about it. But anyway, that's the way it was, and I came from a good Jewish home. My mother was born in Danville, Virginia in 1898, and I was already the third generation in Danville. And so I thought, well, they'll never take me. I'll never get over there. But it's a possibility. So I was chosen to be one of the students. There were two Vassar girls, a Harvard guy and myself. Four of us were chosen to go over in the ship and to an international camp and work for 4 weeks. And then we were supposed to get free passage to France for a week, and then we were to come back to Plymouth, England, and take the same boat, same student ship, back to the U.S. And of course, that's what my parents expected me to do. And I thought, it's a long shot. They'll never take me. You know, it's just sort of a fantasy, but I'm going to try. And when I got to France, we worked in the farm camp, and I got to France, and I didn't know any French. I was majoring in German in college. I mean, I wasn't majoring in it, but that was my foreign language, was German. And strange things have happened to me all my life, something like this. Sort of weird things have happened, coincidences have happened in my life, and this was really one of them, because I didn't know any French, as I said, and I looked in the phone book, and only 2 listings in the entire Paris, in the entire Paris phone book, began with the word J-U-I-F. And I took the underground, a subway, to the first one, and it turned out to be a kosher butcher shop. And I asked the manager where the Israeli embassy was, and he said, "Oh, they're just building it." You know, it was July of 1948, and he said they're just building it, and he gave me the address. And I went to that address, and indeed they were knocking up the walls. The workmen were working, but there was a secretary in there, and she asked me what I wanted, and I said I wanted to join the Israeli army. And she got a little piece of paper about this big, and she wrote out an address, didn't say one word to me, not one word. She wrote that address, gave me that address, and I went to that address. It was an apartment building near the Arc de Triomphe. If you've ever been to France, to Paris. And there was a little 2-room apartment, and sort of Haganah posters on the wall, and 2 Israeli young men there, and they wanted me, and I told them what I wanted, and they said, "Well, how do we know you're Jewish?" And so I recited the Aleph Bet, and that satisfied them, but they knew I was quite young to do this, and they were sort of nervous about it, but they had 3 doctors that examined people, and not there, but regular doctors and other, their own practices who had agreed to examine people who were trying to sign up for the Israeli army. And I passed that, and they gave me a ticket to Marseille, to go to a displaced persons camp in Marseille. And it's sort of interesting in a way that an 18-year-old boy, I had all these roles, different roles. I was given the papers of a man named Zerich Ichkovitz. He took away my passport, and I trusted him to take it, my passport. And they gave me the papers of a displaced person who had survived the Holocaust in I guess, a German work labor camp named Zerich Ichkovitz. And so here I was, a Holocaust survivor, a displaced person, and I was from Danville, Virginia, 18 years old. And I went to and there were 2 other men waiting to take that same train. We 3 of us met. One is a fellow named Frank Perlman, who was 28 years old. He was 10 years older than I, and a veteran of the U.S. Army. The other one was also a veteran of the U.S. Army. Frank was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he was going to the Sorbonne. And the other person was also going to Sorbonne University in Paris, And his name was Jack Schwimmer, and he was from the Bronx. He was about 22 years old. And so the two of us got friendly right away, and we got on the train and got to, I think it was about a 6 or 7 hour train ride down to Marseille, and we were taken to this displaced persons camp, and we lived as displaced persons for 2 weeks in this camp until there would be a ship that would take us to Israel. Which this is in August. We arrived in August, and of course the fighting had been going on since May the 24th. And this was the worst 5 days of my life. This is incredible. This was a DP ship. It had already brought one group of people to from some European city to Palestine to break the British blockade. It managed to do that, but it's hard to describe this ship in any real way. It was a banana boat, a banana boat, from Central America, that they'd taken it at Constantinople or someplace, and they built. If you have the room like half the size, and there were shelves. Three tiers down in the holes. Instead of the holes where the bananas went, there were this 3 tiers. You go down to a wooden ladder. There were steps, but there was more like a ladder to each level. And all around, if you look around this room, you would see shelving, 3 shelves high, a bare light bulb in the middle of the room, and we were each given a place on a shelf 20 inches wide. They put 1,700 people on the ship, and I think they must have been 6 lifeboats. You can imagine, you wouldn't have a chance if someone had come along and put a bomb inside, anything like that. But there were 24 other Americans who had just come from the United States, joined us, so there were about 25 of us. And it was hell on earth. It's the worst 5 days I've ever spent in my entire life. There was very little food. There was usually crackers and sardines. Sometimes a broth was brought to us. It wasn't really, it's not on a luxury ship by any means whatsoever. And that's what they were bringing in, people. Israel needed people. They were being invaded by these countries that had plenty of people. There were only 650,000 people living in Israel then. Israel was a country of 650,000 people who were invaded by 5 countries with standing armies, with tanks, some with airplanes, with guns, and I'm going to show you in a minute what we had in the way of armaments. You won't believe it when you see it. And this was the really ironic part. After 5 days, and sounds a little obscene to tell you this, and you won't think it's possible, but the bathrooms, the toilets, of course there were no toilets. It was built to carry a crew of 13 people, 13 laborers who worked in the holds of this banana boat. And they had 1,700 people aboard, and so they had built latrines on the sides of the boat, say 3 wooden latrines on each side, 10 holers, I call them 10 holers, 10 holes in there, no running water at all. We had to wash out these things a couple of times a day with fire hoses. And the rest, but the thing is, there were 25, say, of us, and 1,700 displaced persons, and they were used to this. They hadn't lived this well in the slave labor. And many of them were men. Women didn't survive. Very few women survived. I mean, right off the bat, they were killed by the Germans, and very few were sent to labor camps. There weren't that many women, and there were a few with babies, young children, and we had army tents, like blankets, not tents, but blankets on the top level of the ship, because there was so little air coming down into the holes although they had periscopes blowing some warm Mediterranean air down, that women with babies, and there were a few of them there, were allowed to sleep on the deck for 5 days so that babies could have a decent amount of air. And the climax of this is when we arrived finally, after 5 days, in Haifa Harbor. We weren't really home yet because the United Nations had observers at the docks to check everybody who got off of that ship to make sure they weren't foreign volunteers volunteering for the Israeli army. In other words, Israel didn't even have control of, and this is 4 or 5 months after the war had actually begun, of its own immigration. And a little tugboat came over beside the ship, and we were asked to jump down. The Americans, the 25 of us, were asked to jump down onto this tugboat, which is quite a bit, you'd say about 12 or 14 feet below the top deck that we were jumping from. And they had rubber mats for us. And so we jumped down, and people caught us when we jumped down. It was at night, and they put us underneath into the hold of the tugboat, and the little tugboat chugged away and went over to another part of the dock, and we evaded the United Nations observers who were trying to keep all foreign volunteers from coming in. Anyway, I was sent to an induction camp, and I wanted to tell you this because it will show you you may think this is impossible. It's not. It was a horrible thing. If you stayed on this deck, you just sweated, just tremendously. I mean, it's just very hot in the month of August. And I went to the toilet one time, and when I went there prepared to do something, a little old lady got on the hole next to mine, dropped her pants and started doing something, and I got up and left. I urinated once in 5 days. I did not move my bowels for 5 days. I mean, it sounds impossible, right? It's going to make the Guinness Book of Records, but it's absolutely true. It was the most horrible 5 days of my entire life. Anything would have been easy in the Israeli army after that, believe me. And what was interesting about it is that although I was not as well trained as the other 24 Americans, because they were all older than I, and there were 3 or 4 women who had been nurses during World War II. All these people had combat experience, equipment experience, everything that I didn't have. But I had something that almost none of them did have, driving experience. Believe it or not, in a small rural town in Virginia, in those days, you could get your driving license at 14. And I had already been driving for 4 years, more than that, because I did all my basic training in driving at 13. And my 15-year-old brother taught me to drive. And my parents trusted him to do it. And he did a good job of it, too. So I knew how to drive. And if you think about it, you don't think about things like this. Very few Israelis knew how to drive, even Sabras. Very few. There were no private cars in Israel. People knew how to drive tractors on kibbutzim, but people did not know how to drive. And obviously, none of the displaced persons coming in knew how to drive. They weren't going to learn to drive in a slave. So I was in great demand. They took me immediately from the induction camp and put me into what is called an armored unit, a so-called armored unit, the 79th Armored Battalion in the northern part of the country near Akko, right above Haifa, at an old British Army base. And then they proceeded. I had a Bulgarian corporal with a handlebar mustache named Marco Confino. He was Jewish. And that all the people who were drivers had been in the Jewish brigade. And they all spoke English perfectly, of course. And that's why I didn't learn it in Hebrew very much. And they taught me to drive this big thing. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. So I want to show you. In all of Israel, Israel had purchased 200 half-tracks. And this is a half-track. If you all can all see it, I'll be glad to pass it around. A half-track was used as a personnel carrier during World War II. It was a personnel carrier. And it was great as a personnel carrier because it had solid steel sides, but it was open on top, completely open on top. I mean, it wouldn't stop a bullet coming down from a hill, even a short hill anywhere around, but it was used to carry personnel to the battlefield, but never to be used as a tank. And Israel had managed to buy 200 of these, this war surplus, and they sneaked them into the country as tractors, because they had tracks on the back, and they convinced somebody that they weren't really tanks at all, and they could be used in the kibbutzim to till the fields and so on. And anyway, they weighed over 10 tons. I had never driven anything this big before. It had actually 8 forward speeds and 2 reverses. And nothing automatic, powered, no power at all. And these things moved, and they started moving 10 tons of steel. The only way you could slow that thing down, it only went about 35 miles an hour, but the only way you could slow this down, and most of you have driven, I'm sure, brakes would not do it. We had a brake, but a brake would not slow that thing down. You had to downshift. If you were using the 4 forward speeds, you had to go from 4th to 3rd to 2nd to 1st. And not until you finally shifted into 1st could that thing slow down enough to stop the thing. So they had to teach me to do that. I didn't know how to do that. And I learned that pretty rapidly. But the interesting part, and I won't dwell on this an awful lot, but the interesting part about this was I was learning to drive this thing. And I'd been there 5 days. And my corporal was a Bulgarian guy named Marco Confino, big handlebar mustache. I think I mentioned that. And he said, Ralph, we have to go out on patrol tonight. There's a bunch of guys that are surrounded by Arabs about 5 miles from here. And I thought it'd be a good idea for you to find out what it's like to go into a place like this. And so, would you like to go along? I said, sure. Stupidly, I said, sure. So I wasn't driving. He was driving the half-track, so I hopped in the back. And it was up in the Galilee. If you've been to Israel in the upper Galilee, there are hills all around and everything. And we were driving along, and all of a sudden, somebody begins shooting at us from a hill, the next hill. And then the armored cars that we had, I'll show you a picture of those, started firing back, and you could see the traces going back and forth. And then you'd hear a bullet hit against the steel side of the half-track. And I was scared to death. I mean, I was really very, very frightened because I couldn't figure out how one of those bullets from the hill would not come into the top of the half-track and strike me between the eyes. And I can still remember doing this, saying, this is not going on. I'm just dreaming. I'm going to wake up. I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be in my dormitory room in Hartley Hall at Columbia, and this is just going to all be a bad dream. And I actually can remember to this day physically pinching my leg so to make sure that I'd be waking up. I said, 10 days ago, I was in Paris in a museum, and somebody's trying to kill me today. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. And no bullet came through the top. I did not wake up. I was already awake, and so that was that. And it was a very interesting experience, and of course, important for my whole life. It made me, when I came back finally, incidentally, this unit never got anything but the half-tracks while I was at it, and I'll show you the kind of armored cars we had, made in Israel. My gun at first was a Sten gun, also made in Israel, with a barrel this long. It was not good for any target over, let's say, 50 yards away. And that's what the Israelis were fighting against. And if you can imagine really this room as being sort of the world, and this stage as being Israel, this is what the Israelis were up against. It was just incredible, just incredible. And the only place that would sell them arms was Czechoslovakia. And probably because the Russians had influence and wanted to get some influence in the Middle East. It's a very long story. Every country in the world, the ones that were supposed, including the United States, embargoed all arms to Israel, even though they knew Israel was being surrounded by enemies. Like they had tanks, they had planes, everything, until Israel could get something. And you had to live that, and you have to understand that. And I'm worried to death sometimes that our own children, and now my grandchildren, and ready for great-grandchildren now. I'm 88 years old, if you've done the arithmetic, and that they don't really get the education or the training about Israel. I'm hopping ahead of myself a little bit because I have to speak about this. You know, 92% of all the Jews in the world today live in either Israel or the United States. The United States and what I call the melting pot countries like Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, to some extent South Africa, the only friends, true friends that Israel has. And it's really up to us, and it sounds like a propaganda speech, but it disturbs me that some of our grandchildren, children on this BDS movement, you know, boycott, divestiture, and so on, that they don't really understand what Israel is up against. It's difficult, very, very difficult for them to understand. And it's up to us to let them know. And let's see what I do with my notes here. In any case, our rabbi in Danville, Virginia, who had a PhD from Heidelberg, he has managed to escape. If you can imagine, poor guy, he had a PhD from Heidelberg University. He was could be a professor in Semitic languages and ancient history, and he was stuck in Danville, Virginia. But we were lucky enough because he was there for 10 years, and then he went on to Wayne State University in Chicago, Detroit, as a professor of Semitic languages, and he was the Hill director, a wonderful person. But he used to say, to tell us that Jews don't believe in miracles. The miracles such as people walking on water and making 10,000 loaves of bread out of one. For Jews, the miracle is when a certain thing happens at a certain time. When an ordinary event, an event that could happen, with a possible exception of the sun standing still, I've never figured that one out, but it's when certain things happen at certain times. And truthfully, for that period of time, from the time of Herzl before the turn of the last century, to people like Chaim Weizmann, to people like Henrietta Zold, David Ben-Gurion, a handful of people were the miracles, were our miracles, because they occurred at a certain time, a certain important time. And I wanted to mention that because we had a few here in America as well, that you probably never heard the names. I doubt that you heard many of the names, because actually some people didn't want their names used after they came back, because there was still a hostile State Department. George Marshall was the Secretary of State, and he was really a nice guy. But the rest of the State Department was pretty much run by, I think I mentioned it, what I call Ivy League anti-Semites, people who really could recognize that it didn't pay off for anybody to be a friend of Israel, because the Arabs had all the oil. Why antagonize the Arabs? The British, who had a lot of interest in the Middle East, were our allies after World War II, and they were the friends of the people in the State Department. And the British were not in favor of a Jewish state any longer. So it didn't make any sense. And we were very, very lucky to have certain people. One that you've never heard of, probably, a very few of you, Eddie Jacobson. How many of you have ever heard of Eddie Jacobson? Okay, you have heard of him. In Kansas City. And he was picked out by the Zionists. He was picked out by the Zionists. He knew nothing about Zionism. He knew very, very little about Zionism. But they knew that he was a very good friend of Harry Truman. And it turned out to be he was. He was the only person that Harry Truman gave permission to the guards at the gate of the White House to let in whenever he came without prior permission from anybody. Harry Truman had been a partner of his in a haberdashery company in Kansas City, and they had served together in the First World War. There was a guy named Rudolf Sonneborn. How many have ever heard of Rudolf Sonneborn? He is the most important person of all. He ran what is called a Sonneborn Committee, and that was a committee of Sonneborn and 18 other Americans, philanthropists, or wealthy persons throughout the United States that formed a committee at the behest of David Ben-Gurion to collect money. And he was the one who collected money from towns like Danville, Baltimore, New York, and everything else. And they met once a week in his apartment in New York City, and it was called the Sonneborn Committee. And almost nobody knows about it today, but they collected all the money. And the heroes were your parents and grandparents, or maybe great-grandparents, I don't know which. But because Jews all over the United States were quietly contributing money that eventually funneled into the Sonneborn Committee, believe it or not, it was going on, and no one got any deduction for it. There were no tax deductions. You didn't dare report giving to Israel on your tax form, even if you got a deduction at that time. And your parents and grandparents were the great heroes, and in a sense were the miracles that Rabbi Kapustin, I call it the Kapustin dictum, that these miracles came forth at that time. The whole Czechoslovakian thing, Israel had no planes. What they had were 3 tanks. Israel had 3 tanks. 2 of them were Centurions that 2 Irish British soldiers defected with and stayed along to run, and a Sherman tank that the Israelis found pieces of when the British left and put together. The whole tank corps that Israel had then, 3 tanks in the half-tracks. We had no artillery. My unit spearheaded the action. We went up and stayed on Mount Sinai. It was sort of interesting. You know, the Israeli army, why not spend the night on Mount Sinai? And we were on Mount Sinai and came down and attacked the Arabs in October 1948 and cleared the entire northern Galilee of Syrian, Iraqi, and Arab Liberation Army troops. And we still had no artillery. We didn't have 1 piece of artillery. The Arabs used artillery against us in that action. We captured the artillery and then sent back to find somebody who knew how to use artillery, and the shells that we also captured, and the next day we were using that artillery against them. The Israeli army just had very, very little. The Israeli army suffered tremendous casualties, as a matter of fact. 1% of its population was killed in the War of Independence. 4,000 soldiers. Remember, they only had a population of 650,000 people. 4,000 soldiers were killed and about 2,600 civilians because the Arabs were dropping arms, etc. And so basically, there were all kinds of people like that that I ask you to think about there. The Mickey Marcus, a man named Mickey Marcus, a West Point graduate, was the first person to hold the position of general in the Israeli army. He was brought over by Ben-Gurion. He wrote the first field manual, and unfortunately, he led the attack on Jerusalem with 3 combined brigades and was killed by his own sentry because he didn't understand. The sentry gave him an order. He came out to go to the bathroom early in the morning, and a sentry gave a command for a password, and Mickey Marcus did not understand the Hebrew, and the sentry shot and killed him. The first admiral in the Israeli the Navy was a West Point, an Annapolis graduate. I'm trying to think of his name now. I knew it like I knew my own, but I can't remember it right now. And anyway, Americans played a role. And if I have just a few minutes, I have another couple of minutes. Okay. I wrote something for myself about recognizing these people, and I'll read it to you. If you don't mind, I'll read it real fast. Immediately after the 1948 war, there was absolutely no publicity about our experience. All American volunteers had violated the terms of their passports and perhaps other laws that extent, risking at best fines and jail time and at worst loss of their citizenship. Canadian laws, if applied strictly, could punish volunteers from that country severely. We did not want publicity, yet pound for pound, American and Canadian Jews contributed more to building the rock-solid foundation of the Israeli armed forces than any other volunteer group. Consider these facts. The first man to hold the rank of Aleph, general, in the Israeli army was David Mickey Marcus, a West Point graduate with a brilliant World War II record. I just mentioned him. The first person to hold the equivalent rank of admiral was Paul Schwimmer, I forgot the name before, of New York City. He was an Annapolis graduate, and he helped pick out the ships, such as the Pan York that I was on. A name that very few people have heard about, but probably the most important of all was a guy named Al Schwimmer. You ever heard of Al Schwimmer? How many people have heard of Al Schwimmer? You should know about Al Schwimmer of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was born on the Lower East Side, incidentally, so New York gets part of the credit for that. He was the second in command of the Israeli Air Force. He directed the purchase of all the heavy aircraft that provided the air bridge to bring arms from Czechoslovakia to Israel. Without that air bridge to bring in huge amounts of rifles, machine guns, and ammunition and fighter planes, Israel might not have won the war. Schwimmer later founded and led Israeli Aircraft Industries, Israel's largest employer with 20,000 employees. Ben Dunkelman, a Canadian with combat command experience in World War II, was brigadier of the 7th Brigade. Some 59% of all the 186 pilots in the Israeli Air Force with World War II experience were American and Canadian, 59%. These experienced fighter pilots halted the Arab bombing of the Israeli cities. They played a key role in stopping the advance of Egyptian armored columns as they neared Tel Aviv. Rudy Augarten of Philadelphia, a Harvard student, shot down 3 enemy planes, trained Israel's first Sabra fighter pilots, then was brought back to Israel in 1950 with the rank of lieutenant colonel to become commander of the Ramat David Air Base, which was used for most training. Israel's entire heavy bomber squadron, 3 B-17s from World War II, came from America and were piloted mostly by Americans. All 5 fighting ships in the Israeli Navy were purchased in America, initially as Aliyah Bet ships, and manned by Americans and Canadians. And finally, I'll just leave you with this. Exodus, which many of you have heard of, Exodus by Leon Uris, turned the entire thing on its head. It was a totally untrue fake story, as our president would call it, but it was really a story that turned everything on its head. The captain of the in the Uris book of the Exodus was an American, but everybody, all the crew were Palestinians. In truth, the captain of the real Exodus was an Israeli, a Palestinian, but the entire crew was American. That story he had a difficult time with the truth in that fiction. The 10 American big ships that ran the British naval blockade between the end of World War II and May 15th brought to Palestinian waters 43% of all the Holocaust survivors rescued in that period of time. Only 2 published novels were written by volunteers about that experience. The people who went over and fought were not highly, I won't say highly educated, they were well educated, but they just weren't novelists. Only 2 real novels came out of that war, so very few people really knew about it. And so I just want to conclude to say my life, I'm the archivist for the American Veterans of Israel and its Legacy Corporation, and I built a museum on this subject, and what's that little pieces of paper I had that they pass it. I'll conclude with this. If you look at that, if you go to that website, you'll see portions of the museum that I built in Gainesville, and a copy is in the American Jewish Museum in Los Angeles. And you'll see more about the American role. But as Americans, we can really be very proud. We can be very, very proud of the role that we and our fathers and grandfathers made in 1948, if only we knew about it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr.